she remains tied to community. She remains true to the values and realities of the everyday woman.
All large-scale change is actually just a lot of small-scale change happening.
So to me, feminism is more of a social and political struggle against all forms of patriarchal oppression.
If you constantly find that you are the smartest person in the room, you've completely failed at feminist leadership.
Ignite that spark in others to have a passion for a particular cause.
So feminist leadership, one of the things we need to understand is not just about women playing leadership roles, being women or feminine. It's more of where women lead differently with feminist analysis, values, and ideologies to advance social justice for all.
I wanna be the change. I wanna be the change. Oh, yeah, and I show, yeah. I wanna be the change. Oh.
Welcome to the Lead Like a Feminist podcast. I'm Emily.
And I'm Malene.
Thank you for joining us on our journey to learn from the people using their power to change the status quo.
So as you all know, we've been trying to find our guests by asking you who you know is leading like a feminist. Then we've been making it our responsibility to track them down and try to find out exactly what they're doing that is changing the world around them. So join us and let's change the status quo together.
So my name is Isabella Akiteng. Currently, I support the Imara Women's Center. Imara is it's a Swahili word that means bold, firm, strong. And so the Imara Women's Center is an initiative of the Forum for Women in Democracy. But away from that, I am also a mentor to a couple of young women. And that's work that I enjoy doing. I teach Sunday school, and that gives me a lot of joy too.
So I wanted to ask you next, something I've asked everybody that I've been speaking to on this podcast. Could you share with us something or someone who inspires you?
Lots of people inspire me. And maybe when I go local on inspiration, and this is a difficult question because our lives are not single issue lives. And so there are aspects that inspire at every turn. But I think the one person who I am spending more time understanding is Martha Karua. She was a former Minister of Justice in the Kenyan government. She was the first woman to run for presidency in Kenya.
I must confess that I'd never heard of Martha Karua before making this podcast. Wikipedia reliably informs me that she's a Kenyan politician and advocate for social justice. But she is so much more than that. There is an amazing story about her literally walking out on President Moi when he was addressing a crowd. An act of extraordinary defiance if you consider the corruption and human rights abuses that marred his presidency. I asked Marlene from African Arts, who's actually working with me on this podcast and happens to be a young Kenyan woman, what she knew and thought about Martha Karua.
So from a Kenyan perspective, I can say that Martha Karua is a bold lady. We actually call her the Iron Lady. She's a lawyer by profession, a very tough politician, a loving and caring mother of two. So we find her as very humble, yet tough, very kind, but also straightforward. So she makes politics to look like a walk in the park cake for women, but we all know that it's not. So she never goes down easily. Her name stands for a champion fighter for gender equality and protection. And you find that as a girl child, I view Martha Karua as an emblem of female strength and boldness.
Right then, thanks Marlene. Let's get back to Isabella and why Martha Karua inspires her.
And the reason she's currently my inspiration is when we were breaking ground for the Imara Women's Center home, we were looking for guests of honor, and she accepted to be guest of honor. And I was tasked with writing the introduction to her for for Engineer Winnie Byanyima, who is the president of UNAIDS, who would be inviting her to speak. And so when I read her, the more I read about her, by the time I was done collecting data on her, I had about 10 pages of her. And she's the first politician in Africa who resigned willingly because she did not agree with her president's position on certain legal matters in Kenya. And I was like, wow, in a society where we are conforming more and more, there's actually someone who told the president, you know what, I will step down because I don't agree with what you are doing. But also there was an interesting one that she chaired the commission around peace and reconciliation after the ethnic clashes in the I think the Kenyan elections of, was it 2011? Anyway, but she chaired that commission, and I think she was the only woman on that commission, or I might be mixing two incidents. But she was talked about as the only man on the commission. She was the only woman. But every time the media talked about her, they said the only man on the commission. And she's gone on to do so much. She was the first, I think, woman to open up a legal practice in Kenya. And so she has so many firsts attached to her, and yet she remains tied to community. She remains true to the values and realities of the everyday woman. Like she does not flaunt her privilege, even as she walks through the corridors of power. Yeah.
Wow.
So Martha Karua.
So I think we're gonna get into some more of the meaty stuff now. I wanted to really find out more about your journey as a feminist leader. And so I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about how your journey started, what the journey's been, kind of what you've learned along the way, so that us other aspiring feminist leaders can learn from your experiences.
So my journey is it's one of those that started, I think, as a cliche journey within the Black, or should I say Ugandan, feminist context, especially with people of my generation, should I say, people of my age category, who had we had the I don't want to call it the unfortunate reality, but we had the disadvantage, and it could well be an advantage of having come to understanding of the gender equality path at a time when there was a lot of backlash on the word feminist, not even the person or the understanding, but just the word. That when someone said that, oh, this is a feminist, the society had labels for us, and the labels are still there today. But I think now we have reached a place where we are more keen to ignore the labels. But at that time, there were real issues. Okay, so feminists were the women who broke people's marriages. Feminists were the women who could not hold on to their marriages. Feminists were the women who, so at that time when we were growing up, that's when the vagina monologues were coming onto the scene. And it's the feminists who brought the vagina monologues. And so feminists were the people who are talking about things that culture had told us not to talk about. And suddenly there I was aspiring to be a feminist. And then I had the opportunity of sitting at the feet of feminists like Salome Nakawesi. There's an amazing woman called Salome Nakawesi. And I was like, wow. Now Salome is the woman who brought the vagina monologues to the country.
Wow.
Okay, she was part of the people who provided space for the monologues to happen. But Justice Solomon is energy. She's life. She's, yeah. If anyone who is listening, if you went to Facebook or Twitter and typed in Solomon Nakawesi and you interacted with her virtually, even before, just through her tweets, through her conversations online, she's life. And I told myself, but this is what I want to do. This is what I was born for. And so I began to understand why it was important to name myself as a feminist. And at this point, for some of us who may not have had access to the African Feminist Charter, it's one of those documents. It's our Bible as feminists. And so the African Feminist Charter talks about the importance of naming ourselves as feminists. And as when you name yourself as a feminist, you understand that the work that you're doing as a feminist is deeply political. And because it's deeply political, it's important that you situate yourself on this battle towards dismantling power and attempting to reduce inequalities between among sexes, but also among different categories of people. And so I named myself, and that's when I said, okay, I'm a feminist. But of course, at that time, I also had a struggle, because at the beginning, you mentioned, you asked me what I do, and I mentioned that I teach Sunday school. So I'm also a deeply religious person. Okay, I don't know if the religious is the right word, but I love God, I love Jesus. And so when I named myself as a feminist, that also became a little bit problematic in my life. Because when we talk about systems of oppression, you cannot talk about systems of oppression and not talk about religious oppression. And so I began to tell myself that, you know what, you belong to a space that has historically been abusive to women. It was a battle as to whether I was going to remain true to my feminism, or I was going to remain true to my Christianity. And up to that point, I had never had anyone have conversations around I had not had anyone have conversations around the intersection between feminism and religion, or feminism and Christianity. And so that was a confusing time in my life. But I prayed and I told myself, surely there must be a place where both of these things exist. And when I found that place where both of them existed, I told myself, now when I label myself, I'll label myself as a Christian feminist, because it's important that people understand where I'm coming from, because there are realities around who I am and how I was socialized. That does not mean that I do not recognize the abuse within the religious structure. But in recognizing the abuse within the religious structure, I will then do everything in my capacity as a Christian feminist to ensure that I challenge systems of oppression within the space of religion. And so when you talk about how do I manage to have these difficult discussions, I manage to have them because I believe that there is space within the feminist movement for us to dialogue. There is space for us to understand whoever disagrees with us. And we must know that as a movement, we will not only have allies, we will have people who deeply disagree with us, and we cannot kill them. We must understand why they disagree with us, because maybe that's one of the ways that we will strengthen our strategies.
You may have noticed Isabella mentioning the African Feminist Charter. This is a really important document developed by the African Women's Development Fund that was formulated during a 2006 gathering of African women feminists from around the world in Accra, Ghana. It's pretty unique, so I asked Isabella to share a bit more about the core principles of African feminism outlined in that short but incredibly insightful document?
So the charter is it's a very short document, but it's a document that was developed by a group of about 12 African sisters, and they came together and developed a document that would guide the feminist path for women on the continent, because a lot of the literature, a lot of the strategy, a lot of the politics around feminism was coming from the West. And even if we had women in the diaspora, the realities of the women in the diaspora were not necessarily reflective of the realities of the women on the continent. And so the African Feminist Charter is a charter for women on the continent, but also Black African women in the diaspora who associate and understand the realities of Black African women on the African continent. So look, the African Feminist Charter, it looks at principles on both. It looks at principles on both the individual and institutional front. Okay, and so at individual level, our principles are around caring, nurturing, and supporting other African feminists and building care and well-being. There's also a principle of non-violence. There's a principle of choice and autonomy regarding bodily integrity issues. There's a principle on the recognition and representation of African women as subjects of our work and not as objects of our work, which is what a lot of Western literature does. Western literature represents us heavily as objects and not necessarily as subjects, but also a recognition of African women's right to healthy, mutually respectful and fulfilling personal relationships, given how we are socialized. And how we are socialized has been dictated to suggest that our identity is an identity that is owned by either our families or owned by husbands or owned by your male relatives. The other principle around the other individual principle is around the right to express our spirituality within or outside of organized religion. And that principle recognizes the fact that when it comes to spirituality, it's not homogeneous, simply because I'm Christian doesn't mean everyone else will be Christian, but also I subscribe as a Christian to Western religion. And yet there are people who might still want to subscribe to their African religion. And yeah, again, it's the right to express our spirituality within or outside of organized religion. But also, the other individual principle is an acknowledgement of the feminist agency of African women, which remains largely undocumented and ignored, And when it comes to institutional to the institutional, now the word has disappeared.
Like the principles for the institute at the institutional level, basically.
Yes, when it comes to institutional to feminist institutions, we are looking at the principle of openness, transparency, and equality in feminist-led institutions, that these are not principles that we should be caught acting against, but also looking at supporting African women's labor rights, including fair and equal remuneration and maternity policies, which again, because of how we are socialized, is a principle that continues to suffer, but also the principle of power and authority and using them responsibly, given the fact that when we talk about feminist leadership, we're talking about power, we're talking about redistributing power, we're talking about dignity. And if we are not cognizant of power and authority, then we run a risk of being abusive and slipping into the patriarchal systems that we are attempting to dismantle. There's also the principle of responsible leadership, which as feminist organizations, we must continue to exercise, and also looking at upholding critical feminist values at all times. Also, we commit as feminist organizations to create spaces for power sharing across generations, because again, when we look at the power dynamics, usually ageism might be found inside the power dynamic because of questions around experience, questions around access, questions around social capital, questions around financial abilities, which will definitely alienate young people. And so it's important that we are actively creating spaces for power sharing across generations, but also across the divide when it comes to the gross inequalities that we continue to experience.
So I think you've already touched there a bit on kind of your understanding of feminist leadership, and kind of what that means. Could you tell us a bit more about that? Kind of how do you define feminist leadership, and what does it look like in action for you?
For me, as a feminist leader, one of the things that trailblazers who raised me focused a lot on was the dignity of the people that we work with. So when we talk about feminist leadership, there must be an element of dignity in it. If there are people in the space, we must treat them with dignity, whether or not they are whether or not you have an office hierarchy. Because again, a lot of feminist spaces have adopted the hierarchical mode of leadership, and the challenge with the hierarchical mode of leadership is that it automatically plays into the power imbalances and dynamics that the patriarchy has established. And so for me, feminist leadership is saying that if there is at all a hierarchy, that the least in the hierarchy is treated with as much dignity as the one at the top. It's also saying that there must be an equitable distribution of resources. So we cannot have too great a gap in terms of remuneration between the person at the top of the hierarchy and the person at the bottom. But if we are looking at, for example, health, access to health, which is a key conversation in the feminist space. If you're looking at education, and in an institution, you say that you will only give medical insurance, for example, to key staff. That is problematic. I think if you're to give medical insurance to everyone, because everyone is a human being that runs the risk of falling sick on a daily basis and must have the right to good medical health care. So I think for me, when it comes to dignity, before we even have any further conversation, when it comes to feminist leadership, it's about deliberately ensuring that there is an environment of dignity in your policies, in your language, in your structure, and in your programs, but also in the benefits that you give to the people that you work with.
But yeah, just to kind of wrap up, could you summarize for us in just a couple of sentences what it means to lead like a feminist? Because that's the name of the podcast. That's what we're trying to find out on this journey. So yeah, what does it mean to you to lead like a feminist?
Thank you very much. For me, really, at the end of the day, feminism is around dismantling systems of power, dismantling systems of oppression, redistributing power, redistributing resources, so that inequality is is reduced. And so if we are to lead like feminists, we must be alive to one, dignity, because the problem with power is that it indignifies. So we must be alive to ensuring that the people around us are treated with dignity in speech, in action, and in engagement. So one, dignity. Two is if we are to dismantle power, we must be alive to the privileges we carry everywhere we go. Each of us is privileged at different points in life or different points of the day. And so we must be alive to the privilege that we carry and check our privilege, because if we do not check our privilege, then we end up abusing people. So we must be alive to that reality. The third one is to make ourselves vulnerable so that we can be held accountable. Because in the event that you abused your privilege, in the event that you abused your power, we must feel comfortable enough to call you out. And so if you're a feminist leader who is not being called out, yeah, check your feminism. Check it. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. And then just to kind of finish, I think, we're all here because we want to change the way things are. I think most people come to this point because they're frustrated with injustice. They want to see quite radical change. And so what are your practical tips for people who really want to lead in the way that you're describing, who really want to change the status quo? They want to go on that journey. Maybe they're already on that journey, but they're feeling frustrated, they're feeling tired. What are your tips and advice for those kind of fellow travelers on this journey to lead like a feminist?
One is that feminists are not Jesus. Feminists are not perfect. Our feminist sisters are individuals. They are human beings with flesh and blood. Feminists make mistakes. Feminists hurt people. Outside the amazing things we do, we are human. And so it's important that you enter the movement with that at the back of your mind. It's important that you enter the movement with the reminder that they give us when we are doing driving lessons, that imagine you're the only sober driver on the road. So treat all the other drivers with a pinch of question, so that you're not expecting too much. And I think that's one of the things that has helped me on this journey, that I try to not hold feminists to the highest of standards. It's important to hold them to high standards. But the problem is that when we put feminists on pedestals and they fall, they hurt us badly. And when they hurt us badly, recovery is difficult. And I speak from experience that there are sisters that I put up in the clouds, but because they were human beings, they fell short. And I am dealing with the recovery and the shock and the pain of realizing that they were human beings after all. And so it's important that we remember that we are human beings on this journey. And it's important that we play our part to the best of our abilities. And so maybe if all of us are being the best of our individual selves, then we can bring the best of ourselves to the movement and we can have a combined effort of bests in it. But I think we should remember every day that we are not Jesus.
We thank you so much.
We've come to the final postmortem. So Emily, I would first of all like to know what you feel about reconciling identities. There is lately we talk about learning, unlearning, and relearning. So what do you feel are some of the things that you have had to learn or unlearn or relearn so that you can be able to fuel your goal?
So I think something that I suppose I've had to unlearn, I think, is this idea of what being a professional leader looks like. And I think even things like dressing smartly, like it's something that some people place a lot of value on, but actually, you know, it's just a convention. And I think a lot of people feel really uncomfortable in you know, a sort of a very smart suit, and they feel more themselves in something else. And I know it's a really small thing, but I think being yourself in how you look and how you dress, it helps you to be yourself in all other aspects. And so I think something I've kind of something that I was taught that I've unpicked is actually I don't have to, because I actually love bright clothes. I love, you can, I know it's a podcast, but I've got very short blonde hair. Like I like kind of to, you know, look and dress a certain way. And I think just being like, actually, if I can be myself more in how I dress and how I look and not worry about what people will think about that, then I can be myself more truly in other ways. And I think when I was younger and I was first a CEO, I was always very worried about when I was meeting with big funders or you know, important partners, I was always very keen to try and look a particular part. And I think over time I've been like, actually, you know what, I'm more effective when I'm fully myself, and actually we're going to have a more effective partnership if they see me and the organization I represent for what we are. And if that's not right, it's better for them to work that out sooner, and for us to part ways or do something else rather than to go forward on a false pretense. So I think for me, it's, even though sometimes it's painful to be yourself and to be rejected, I think it's better to do that than to go along with an illusion, and for people further down the line to realize, oh, actually that's not quite what you are or what this is, because I think that just leads to more problems and less trust. So it sounds silly, but I think little things like deciding to have your hair how you want, if you want to have a couple of piercings, deciding that you're going to wear the shirt that you want rather than the one that you think is most like what your manager wants to see. I think those small decisions, they help you to, when it comes to the big decisions, be more truly yourself, because you're practicing it in small ways kind of every day.
There is this ideology that Isabella brings out of the African Feminism Charter. So how do you feel about localizing efforts? Because I think there has been quite a disconnect when we have Western funders come to Africa and they have this ideology of what should be done and how we should do it. Yet you find that collides with some of our cultural beliefs. So what do you feel about localizing our efforts, trying to make them inclusive?
Yeah, and I think you're right, because I think there's actually a really big issue around perhaps when we have power, inadvertently imposing our ideologies on others, even if they're good ideologies. You know, even if I'm a Western feminist and Western feminism has done a lot of good things in my context, to then take those values and kind of impose them on somebody else because I have more money or more influence, I think is a really big problem. And I think it's a problem because it, like you're saying, it undermines the identity of the people in those contexts. So if I go to work with some East African feminists and I say, because I've got the money, we're going to do things according to my ideology, my priorities, even if they're, you know, okay, they're fine, but they're not from that context, I sort of cripple or their ability or sort of hold back their ability to be fully themselves, because I'm not, I suppose, in order to be yourself, to have your full identity, you need to have your own ideology, you need to have your own framework. And so I think it's really important that those of us who want to lead like feminists are very thoughtful about how we do that. And actually, if we do, I think we should work in partnership across the world. I think we need a global community. And I think we learn more, we become better leaders when we work across contexts. But that needs to be a partnership, and not just a partnership in terms of resource, but a partnership in terms of forming our shared ideology. I've learned so much about African feminism that has changed my life and the way I view my everything. It's transformative. And I hope that through my interactions with my colleagues in East Africa, they've also learned something from me. And I think if we can do it in a positive way, we all become better. We need to be explicit about our ideology, and we need to start, when we're working across cultures, we need to start by saying, okay, what is the shared framework here that we're working in? And so I think for me, that's probably one of the most important things that we can do as feminist leaders when we're working across cultures is stop and think about what that shared ideology is.
Lately, I think most of us are talking about shifting the power. So I will just pose a challenge to the people in the global north who are supporting people in the global south to kind of sit down and rethink these structures, see how they can be inclusive for both, how they can both contribute towards the solution. We can even encourage more ownership at the local level, because I believe that is what makes most of the projects successful, ownership by the locals. At some point, the reason I think most funders talk about the fact that Africans are over-dependent on aid, it's not actually over-dependence. It's the fact that some funders or some partners have not come to ask the community what they can contribute towards the efforts. So I think that is also a challenge I would like to pose to other leaders. So thank you very much, Emily, for that. It was a pleasure.
Great, thank you.
We all have to be bold. We all have to be strong, because at the end of the day, it is us who are going to bring about the change that we envision for tomorrow. So be bold. Kuwa Imara.
I wanna be the change.
If you liked what you heard today, check out our social media pages at Lead Like a Feminist for more reflective questions and content to help you explore your role as a feminist leader. Remember to follow us or subscribe to get updates on new podcast releases and other amazing content to help you lead like a feminist. Finally, if you know someone amazing who is leading like a feminist who you think we should be learning from on this podcast, or you've got some big thoughts or personal experiences to share based on what you've heard today, get in touch at leadlikeafeminist@gmail.com.